From the outside, Donald Trump Jr. seemed to have it all: wealth, influence, and a name that carried weight wherever he went. Yet, beneath the surface of luxury and power, something inside him felt hollow. He lived in a world of high expectations, where every move was scrutinized, every decision measured by public perception. His days were filled with board meetings, media appearances, and carefully curated social events. But in the rare moments of solitude, when the noise of the world faded, he felt a creeping sense of emptiness. One evening, after a long day of obligations, he found himself stuck in traffic on a busy New York street. The city lights flickered against his car window, the honking of impatient drivers filling the air. He sighed, rubbing his temples. It was one of those days where exhaustion felt more than physical. It settled deep in his soul. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp knock on the car window. Donald Jr. turned, his heartbeat quickening. A man stood outside, his face partially shadowed by the dim streetlights. His clothes were worn, his hands unsteady. Before Donald Jr. could react, he saw it: the glint of a knife in the man's trembling grasp. "Give me your wallet and phone. Now!" The man's voice was rough, filled with desperation rather than malice. His grip on the knife was tight, yet unsteady, as if he wasn't sure of his own actions. Instinct told Donald Jr. to comply, to avoid trouble. But something in the man's eyes made him hesitate. There was fear, pain, and something else: hesitation. Instead of panicking, Donald Jr. took a slow breath and studied the man before him. This wasn't just a criminal. This was a man on the edge. "You're nervous," Donald Jr. said, his voice calm but firm. The man's jaw tightened. "Shut up and do what I said." Donald Jr. noticed his shaking hands, the sweat glistening on his forehead. He wasn't just some reckless thug. He was desperate. "What's your name?" Donald Jr. asked. The knife wavered slightly. The man hesitated, his breathing heavy. "Why does it matter?" "Because I can see you don't want to do this," Donald Jr. replied. For a moment, the man said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged, his grip on the knife loosening just a fraction. "Michael," he muttered, barely above a whisper. Donald Jr. nodded. "All right, Michael. Now tell me, why are you doing this?" Michael's eyes darted around, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Then, suddenly, his entire expression crumbled. Tears welled in his eyes. He lowered the knife slightly but didn't let go. "I have no choice. My daughter, she's hungry. I've tried everything. No one gives me a chance. I don't know what else to do." Donald Jr. felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. He had seen hardship from a distance, spoken about economic struggles in interviews, but never had he faced it so directly. Never had he looked into the eyes of a man who had lost all hope. "How old is she?" Donald Jr. asked softly. 6, Michael whispered, his voice cracking. "And I'm a failure. I can't even feed my own kid." A heavy silence filled the space between them. The city outside continued as usual, horns blaring, people rushing, but in that moment, it all felt far away. Then, with steady hands, Donald Jr. reached for his wallet. Not in fear, but with purpose. Michael flinched. "I don't want your pity." "It's not pity." Donald Jr. pulled out several bills and extended them. "This is for your daughter to eat tonight. But I don't just want to give you money. I want to help you for real." Michael blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "Help me, how?" Donald Jr. tilted his head. "Do you want a second chance? Or do you want to keep living like this?" Michael stood frozen, his eyes shifting between the money in Donald Jr.'s hand and the knife in his own. His entire body trembled, not just from hunger, but from the weight of a decision that could change everything. And then, in one defining moment, he let the knife slip from his fingers. The dull clang of metal hitting the pavement felt like the closing of a door, one that Michael was finally ready to walk through. Donald Jr. didn't look away. He saw a broken man, but not beyond repair. "Get in the car," he said, unlocking the passenger door. Michael hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to run, to escape, to believe that no one in the world truly wanted to help him. "Why?" Michael asked, his voice barely audible. Donald Jr. met his gaze. Because you said you want to change. And words mean nothing if you don't take action. So, are you ready to turn your life around, or not? The warm breeze of the New York night rustled Michael's worn-out jacket. Around them, the city moved on, unaware of the life-altering moment unfolding in that instant. Michael swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he reached for the door handle. Donald Jr. exhaled slowly as Michael sat beside him, his breath unsteady, his mind still racing. The traffic began to move, but inside the car, a different kind of movement had already begun. The first step of a man who had been given one last chance. Now it's your turn. What would you do in Michael's place? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between the easy way out and the right way forward? Drop a comment below and let us know. Light bulb if this story moved you. Hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. And don't forget to subscribe. Join our community and never miss another story that can change lives. Turn on notifications so you'll be the first to know when the next chapter drops. The car ride was silent. Michael sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his knees, his fingers twitching every now and then. Donald Jr. stole quick glances at him, noticing the tension in his posture, the way his breath hitched slightly, as if he expected this to be some kind of elaborate trick. Michael's life had been a series of disappointments, and trust wasn't something he gave away easily. The city lights blurred past him as they drove. Donald Jr. had no idea what he was doing, but he knew this moment meant something. Finally, he broke the silence. Have you worked before? Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening. Yeah, I was a construction worker. Good at it, too. But the company shut down, and after that, his voice trailed off, frustration thick in his words. Donald Jr. nodded, gripping the steering wheel. And your family? A bitter chuckle escaped Michael's lips. She left, took everything but our daughter. Said she couldn't live with someone who couldn't provide. His fingers clenched into fists. She wasn't wrong. Donald Jr. exhaled through his nose. Where are you living now? Michael let out a slow breath. A borrowed shack. By no any day now, I'll get kicked out. I don't even blame the guy. He has his own family to take care of. Donald Jr. tightened his grip on the wheel. The weight of Michael's reality sank deeper with every word. How many other men were living the same story? How many had reached this breaking point and had no one to turn to? He made a split-second decision. I have a brother, Donald Jr. said. We haven't spoken in a while, but he runs construction companies across the city. He might be able to get you a job. Michael's head snapped toward him, disbelief flashing in his eyes. You serious? I wouldn't joke about this. Michael scoffed, rubbing his hands together anxiously. You don't even know me. Why would you do this? Donald Jr. met his gaze. Because I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Michael didn't respond immediately. He stared out the window, watching as the city pulsed with life. People laughing on sidewalks, neon signs glowing, taxis speeding through intersections. He had forgotten what it was like to just exist without fear. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, and what if I mess up? Donald Jr. kept his eyes on the road. Then you fix it. You keep going. Michael let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. You make it sound easy. It's not, Donald Jr. admitted, but it's better than the alternative. Michael didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, as if the first time in a long time, a tiny ember of hope had been lit inside him. Minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of a tall office building. Michael hesitated before stepping out. The sight of the glass doors, the polished marble floors inside, the expensive cars parked outside, all felt too far from his reality. He swallowed hard. Your brother, he knows who I am? Donald Jr. locked the car and started walking toward the entrance. Not yet, but he will. And it's up to you to show him who you want to be. Michael hesitated for a moment longer before finally following. Inside, the receptionist glanced up, her expression neutral at first, but when her gaze landed on Michael, her brows knit together slightly. Donald Jr. ignored it. We're here to see Eric Trump. The receptionist hesitated before making a call. Within moments, an elevator door dinged open, and there he was, Eric Trump, standing tall in a navy blue suit, arms crossed. The air between the two brothers was heavy. It had been too long since they had spoken. "So you actually showed up," Eric said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement, but his gaze was sharp. "It was about time," Donald Jr. replied. Eric's eyes flicked toward Michael, assessing him from head to toe. Michael shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny, aware of how out of place he must have looked in his worn-out clothes. Eric raised an eyebrow. "And who's this?" Michael opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Donald Jr. said it plainly. "He tried to rob me tonight." Silence. Eric's expression remained unreadable, but his jaw tensed slightly. Michael lowered his head, the weight of shame pressing against his chest. Donald Jr. continued, his voice unwavering. "But I saw something else in him. A father desperate to feed his daughter. A man who's lost everything but still has something left to fight for." Eric exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against his arm. "And you brought him here. Why?" "Because I believe in second chances." A long pause. Michael's fists clenched at his sides. He knew this was it. His one shot at something different. Eric looked between his brother and Michael, his gaze unreadable. Then, after a moment, he pulled out his phone. "Marcos," he said into the receiver. "Do we have any openings at the Savassi project?" Michael's breath caught in his throat. A beat of silence. Then Eric nodded, ending the call. "You start tomorrow." Michael blinked. "Just like that?" "No," Eric corrected. "Not just like that. If you fail me, you're out. No second chances after this." Michael swallowed hard, then gave a firm nod. "I won't waste this." Eric studied him for a moment before gesturing toward the elevator. "See that you don't." Michael felt his chest tighten, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. Donald Jr. clapped a hand on his shoulder as they stepped back toward the exit. "Now let's see what you do with this chance." Michael breathed deeply, staring up at the towering skyline. For the first time in years, he had something to look forward to. Michael lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the small room he had called home for the past few months. The walls were thin and the sounds of the city seeped through, a siren in the distance, a car horn blaring, the occasional murmur of voices outside. His daughter, Emily, slept peacefully beside him, curled up in a blanket too thin for the cold, creeping in through the window. Tomorrow was his first real opportunity in years. And yet, his stomach churned with anxiety. Could he really do this? Would they even accept him? Or was this all just some cruel test to watch him fail? His hands clenched into fists. He couldn't afford to mess this up. Not for himself. Not for Emily. The next morning, Michael arrived at the construction site earlier than anyone else. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a dim, orange glow over the skeletal framework of the building they were working on. He took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. He had worked in construction before. His hands remembered the weight of bricks, the roughness of cement bags, the feel of sweat dripping down his back after hours of hard labor. But this time it was different. This time, he was starting from nothing. A few workers trickled in, their conversations casual as they sipped coffee and stretched out their sore muscles. Then, a burly man with a clipboard walked up. His name tag read Marcos. "You the new guy?" Marcos asked, giving him a once-over. Michael straightened his posture. "Yes, sir." "Michael." Marcos narrowed his eyes. "Eric said you were a charity case." Michael swallowed hard but kept his gaze steady. "I'm here to work." Marcos smirked. "We'll see about that." He gestured toward a pile of cement bags. "Start unloading these onto the scaffolding. And don't slack. No one here is going to pick up the slack for you." Michael nodded and got to work. The weight was familiar, but heavier than he remembered. His muscles burned, his breath grew uneven, and sweat formed on his brow within minutes. But he didn't stop. For the first time in a long time, he had something to prove. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly on the workers. Michael's arms ached, his fingers were raw, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. But he kept going. He noticed some of the workers glancing his way, whispering. Some looked amused, others indifferent. They were waiting for him to fail. And then, just as he finished stacking a heavy cement bag, his foot slipped on loose gravel. He lost his balance. The bag toppled over, and so did he. He landed hard on the ground, the impact jarring his bones. A few workers burst out laughing. Figures. One of them muttered. Michael clenched his jaw, pushing himself up. He wouldn't let this be the end. He reached for the bag again, only for a foot to press down on it, stopping him. He looked up. Marco stood there, arms crossed. "Go home, Michael. You're not cut out for this." Michael's chest tightened. "No, not like this. Give me one more chance," he said, his voice steady despite the burn in his throat. Marco scoffed. "You're too slow, too weak. We need men who can keep up." Michael met his gaze. "I can. Just let me prove it." Marco studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Fine. One more screw-up and you're out. Now get back to work." Michael exhaled in relief. He grabbed the fallen cement bag and hoisted it back into place, ignoring the soreness in his muscles. He wouldn't break. He couldn't. Not when this was his only chance to rewrite his future. Now it's your turn. Do you think Michael will prove himself? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to prove your worth? If this story moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Don't forget to subscribe. Be part of our community where stories of transformation come to life. Turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter. It's only getting more intense. The days that follow were a blur of exhaustion, sweat, and aching muscles. Michael arrived early every morning, long before most of the other workers. He hauled cement bags, mixed concrete, and climbed scaffolding until his arms felt like they would give out. Every night, he collapsed onto the thin mattress in his small room, barely able to move. But he refused to quit. He couldn't. There was no safety net, no second option. If he failed here, he failed his daughter. Yet, no matter how hard he worked, the other workers still eyed him with suspicion. To them, he wasn't one of them. To Marcos, he was still just a charity case. Michael could feel the judgment in every glance, in every whispered conversation that stopped when he walked by, but he kept going. Then, on the fifth day, the accident happened. It started as a normal shift, if exhaustion, blisters, and bruises could ever feel normal. Michael was on the scaffolding, securing metal rods for the next layer of concrete, when he heard shouting below. "Hey, watch out." Michael barely had time to turn his head before something slammed into his back. A loose beam had been knocked from above. The force of the impact sent him forward. His boot slipped on the metal plank. For a split second, he was weightless. Then, gravity took over. Michael fell. The world blurred around him. His arms flailed, desperately reaching for something. Anything to grab onto. Then, pain. His body hit the ground hard. A sharp, tearing pain ripping through his side. Everything went silent. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Eric Trump. His brother's presence beside him was unexpected. But there he was, standing near the edge of the site, watching with a carefully neutral expression. Michael barely had time to register it before Marcos' voice cut through the daze. "That's it. You're done." Michael's heart pounded. "No, wait. I can keep going." He pushed himself up, wincing as fire shot through his ribs. He could barely breathe, but he fought to steady himself. "You can't even stand up straight." Marcos crossed his arms. "Go home. You're just slowing everyone else down." Michael clenched his fists. He could feel the stares, some pitiful, some relieved that they wouldn't have to work alongside the guy who had fallen behind. This was it, the moment he had feared the most. But then, before he could respond, Eric spoke. "Give him one more chance." The words sliced through the tension like a knife. Michael turned to look at him, his chest tightening. Marcos frowned. "You want me to waste more time on this guy?" Eric shrugged, his face unreadable. "That's what my brother wants, isn't it?" Donald Jr. stood beside him, arms crossed, nodding once. Marcos sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, one more. But if he falls again, I don't want to hear another word about it." Michael swallowed hard. He had one last chance. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. Speech balloon, what'd he think? Should Michael get another shot? Have you ever had to fight for one last chance? Michael's body screamed in protest as he forced himself to stand upright. The pain in his ribs was sharp. Each breath a struggle, but he refused to show weakness. Eric Trump stood with arms crossed, watching, while Marcos still looked unconvinced. Michael met Marcos's gaze, his voice firm despite the pain. "Tell me what needs to be done." Marcos exhaled sharply. "Fine, get back to work." The workers around them muttered among themselves, some shaking their heads. No one expected him to last much longer. Michael didn't care. He bent down, ignoring the way his side throbbed, and lifted a cement bag onto his shoulder. Step by step, he moved forward. The sun climbed higher. Hour after hour, Michael pushed through the pain. Each movement sent jolts of fire through his ribs, but he refused to stop. He tuned out the voices, the doubts, the skeptical glances. All he focused on was the task in front of him, brick by brick, load by load, breath by breath. At some point, Marcos stopped watching him with amusement. Now, there was something else in his expression. Michael noticed it out of the corner of his eye, a shift. It wasn't respect. Not yet, but it wasn't dismissal anymore either. Michael kept working, even when his muscles burned, even when his legs felt weak, even when his lungs ached. He kept going. By the time the shift ended, he was soaked in sweat, his entire body trembling. Marcos walked past him, pausing for the first time. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, a single nod. Michael exhaled slowly. He had survived another day. But more than that, he had proven something. To them, and to himself. The next morning, Michael woke up before dawn, his body sore, his ribs still aching from fall. But this time, something felt different. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting. Emily was still asleep, curled up under the thin blanket. Michael brushed a strand of hair from her face, taking a deep breath. One more day. Just take it one day at a time. When he arrived at the construction site, the usual stares greeted him. But there was a difference. The mocking looks were gone. They weren't welcoming, but they weren't dismissing him either. Michael got to work without a word. He lifted, carried, built, climbed. No complaints. No hesitation. He moved as though the pain wasn't there, as if his ribs weren't bruised, as if every muscle in his body wasn't screaming. And this time, no one laughed. At lunchtime, Michael sat on a low concrete ledge, sipping water, when a shadow fell over him. He looked up. It was Marcos. For the first time, the man didn't have a smirk or a dismissive remark. Instead, he held something out, a sandwich. Michael hesitated. Was this a test? A joke? Take it. Marcos said, his tone flat. Michael reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the wrapped sandwich before gripping it. You worked hard today, Marcos muttered. Eat. Michael nodded, unwrapping the food in silence. The simple act meant more than words ever could. He had earned something today, a sliver of respect. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days bled into weeks. Michael had stopped counting. His body had adjusted to the grueling pace. His muscles no longer protested with every lift, but the exhaustion never truly left. Every morning before dawn, he would wake up in the same tiny room, his daughter still curled up under their worn-out blanket, and remind himself, one more day to prove himself, one more day to show he belonged, one more day to make sure Emily never went to bed hungry again. But just when he thought he was finally making progress, life tested him again. The unexpected blow. It started as a normal shift, the usual routine, the same heavy loads, the same unforgiving heat. But Michael had gotten used to it. He no longer flinched when the weight of a cement bag landed on his shoulder. His ribs, though still tender, had healed enough for him to move without wincing. The other workers no longer ignored him completely. Some nodded in passing. A few even gave him small words of acknowledgement. Marcos, though still tough, had stopped doubting him out loud. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a place here. Then, the foreman called him over. "Hey, Michael, you got a visitor." Michael frowned, confused. A visitor? Here? He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve and stepped away from the sight, his boots crunching against gravel. And then he saw her, Emily's mother, standing just beyond the fence, arms crossed, a smirk on her lips. Michael's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen her in over a year, not since she had walked out, leaving him alone with their daughter. What was she doing here? He approached cautiously, keeping his voice steady. "What do you want?" She tilted her head, eyes scanning his sweat-streaked clothes, his rough hands. "You actually got a job," she said, almost amused. "Didn't think you had it in you." Michael exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Why are you here?" She sighed, her smirk fading slightly. "Look, I've been thinking. Maybe Emily would be better off with me." Michael's heart stopped. "What?" She shrugged. "I've got a new place now. More stable. A real home. She shouldn't be living in that shack with you. It's time she came with me." Michael felt the ground beneath him shift. His entire world, the one he'd been clawing his way back into, was suddenly on the verge of collapsing. The fear of losing everything. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You left her." She lifted a shoulder. "And now I'm back. She cried for you. For months. She begged me to go find you." His hands clenched into fists. "And now, suddenly, you care?" She narrowed her eyes. "Don't act like you're some saint, Michael. You think a construction job means you can give her what she needs? You can barely afford food." The words cut deep because they were true. No matter how hard he worked, he was still barely scraping by. But at least he was trying. Michael's mind raced. Could she take Emily? Would she fight for custody? The thought of losing his daughter, of waking up in that empty room without her, made his stomach twist in knots. He gritted his teeth. "Emily stays with me." She smirked again. "We'll see about that." Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the city. Michael stood there, his fists still clenched, his breath coming fast. For the first time since he started this job, he felt the urge to run, to disappear, to escape, because if he lost Emily, what was the point of any of this? A test of strength. Michael didn't return to work right away. He stood there, staring at the ground, trying to steady himself. Then a voice behind him. "You good?" Michael turned. Eric Trump. Unlike last time, Eric wasn't standing with arms crossed, analyzing him from a distance. This time, his expression was unreadable, but there was something else in his eyes. Concern? No, curiosity. Michael hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just personal stuff." Eric studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You want to talk about it?" Michael almost laughed. Since when did guys like Eric Trump care about guys like him? But instead of brushing it off, he found himself saying, "Someone's trying to take my daughter from me." Eric's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. Then, asterisk, asterisk, and what are you going to do about it? Michael looked down at his raw, calloused hands, his aching muscles, the body he had pushed to the limit for weeks, all for her. He exhaled. "I'm going to fight." Eric nodded, as if he expected that answer, then get back to work. Michael blinked. "What? You want to win? Then don't stop now. Work harder. Be better. Prove to everyone, prove to her, that you're the one who deserves to keep Emily." Michael stared at him, and then something inside him clicked. Eric was right. He couldn't control what Emily's mother did. He couldn't stop her from trying to take Emily away, but he could fight like hell to prove that he was the better choice. Michael nodded, and without another word, he turned back toward a construction site, because he still had work to do. The next morning, Michael woke up before his alarm. The weight in his chest was heavier than usual. The conversation with Emily's mother replayed in his mind on an endless loop. She was coming for his daughter. The fear sat in his stomach like a rock. He had spent so long fighting to climb out of the hole he'd been buried in, But what if it wasn't enough? What if the world didn't care how hard he worked? What if they still saw him as the man who had once lost everything? He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything. Michael glanced at Emily, still fast asleep, her small body curled under the blanket. He wouldn't let anyone take her from him, no matter what it took, pushing beyond the pain. At the construction site, Michael worked harder than ever. It wasn't just about proving himself to Marcos or the other workers anymore. It was about proving that he was the kind of man who could keep his daughter. Each bag of cement he lifted, each brick he stacked, each step he took, it wasn't just labor, it was his fight, and people noticed. The whispers among the workers weren't dismissive anymore. They were curious, respectful. Marcos didn't throw sarcastic remarks his way. Instead, he observed in silence, as if waiting to see how far Michael could push himself. But not everyone was impressed. Near the end of the shift, Michael was stacking wooden pallets when one of the senior workers, a guy named Russo, walked over. Russo was built like a tank, his arms covered in faded tattoos. He had been working at the site for years and had made it clear from day one that he didn't like Michael. "You think breaking your back will make you one of us?" Russo scoffed, crossing his arms. Michael didn't stop working. "I don't care what you think of me." Russo smirked. "That's your problem. You think this is just about lifting bricks. You don't get it. Guys like you don't last here." Michael paused for a second, his grip tightening around the wooden pallet. "And what kind of guy am I?" Russo leaned in slightly. "The kind that quits when things get too hard." Michael felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm still here, aren't I?" Russo chuckled, shaking his head. "For now." Then he walked off, leaving Michael with clenched fists and a burning desire to prove him wrong. The unexpected offer. At the end of the shift, Michael was exhausted. His body ached, his hands were raw, and his ribs still hadn't fully healed. But he had survived another day. As he was about to leave, Eric Trump called him over. Michael hesitated. His interactions with Eric had been limited to silent observations and the occasional test of endurance. What did he want now? He wiped the sweat from his forehead and walked over. "Yeah." Eric didn't waste time. "Do you know how to operate a crane?" Michael blinked. "What?" "A crane," Eric repeated. "The site needs a new operator. You've been busting your ass out here. You want something better?" Michael's heart pounded. A crane operator made more money, more responsibility, more stability. He could barely believe Eric was even offering. But then doubt crept in. What if this was a test? What if he failed? What if he got comfortable too soon and lost everything again? Eric must have seen the hesitation in his face, because he spoke again, his voice lower this time. "You want to keep your daughter, right?" Michael's breath caught in his throat. Eric's gaze was steady. "Then stop acting like a worker and start acting like a man who's going to build something." Michael clenched his fists. Then he nodded. "I'll do it." Eric smirked. "Good. Be here at 6 a.m. sharp. Don't make me regret this." A different kind of test. The next morning, Michael arrived before sunrise. He had spent the night watching videos, reading manuals, and preparing himself for whatever test Eric was going to throw his way. When he stepped onto the site, the massive crane loomed over him. Marcos, Russo, and a few other workers stood nearby, watching. Michael could feel the doubt in their stares. Eric approached him, clipboard in hand. "You mess this up, you go back to lifting bricks." Michael nodded once. "I won't mess up." He climbed into the operator's seat, his hands gripping the controls. For a moment, he froze. This was so much bigger than anything he had ever done. But then he thought of Emily, of her laughter, of her tiny hands gripping his when she was scared. He took a deep breath, and he started the machine. One shot. At first, everything was smooth. The crane moved as expected. The weight shifted easily. Then, Russo muttered something under his breath. Michael's focus wavered for just a second. And in that second, the metal beam he was lifting tilted too far to the left. Michael's heart stopped. If he didn't correct it, it would crash. And if it crashed, his chance was over. He gritted his teeth, forced himself to shut out everything. The workers, the doubt, the fear, with a slow, careful movement. He adjusted the controls, bringing the beam back into position. It worked. When he finally lowered the load into place, he exhaled sharply, his entire body tense. Silence. Then Marcos clapped. A slow, deliberate clap. Eric nodded, a small smirk on his lips. Not bad. Michael let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He had done it, a step closer to redemption. At the end of the day, as Michael was packing up, Marcos passed by him. Guess you're not just a brick mover after all. Michael chuckled, shaking his head. Guess not. For the first time, Marcos smiled. A real smile. Michael had won something today. Not just a new job. Respect. He wasn't at the top yet, but he wasn't at the bottom anymore, either. And tomorrow, he would climb even higher. Michael had been working as a crane operator for nearly 2 weeks now. It was a completely different world from hauling cement and stacking bricks. The view from a crane's cabin was breathtaking. New York stretching out before him. Skyscrapers piercing the sky. The city moving like an endless machine below. But the responsibility was overwhelming. One wrong move, 1 second distraction, and everything could come crashing down. And the stakes were higher than ever. He had to keep this job. Not just for himself. For Emily. For the custody battle that was looming over him like a storm cloud. Michael wasn't just fighting against the weight of steel beams and concrete. He was fighting against his past. And every day, he felt the pressure tightening around his chest. Doubt creeps in. Michael had expected the physical demands of the job. What he hadn't expected was the mental strain, the height, the endless calculations, the unforgiving precision. There were no second chances when you were 50 feet in the air, holding tons of steel in your hands. One mistake could end a life, and that knowledge ate away at him. At night, he barely slept. He'd wake up in a panic, his mind replaying the day's work over and over, convinced he had done something wrong, that maybe tomorrow his luck would run out. And Russo was making things easier. Careful up there, newbie. One slip, and we all go home early. Michael ignored him, but the word stuck. It was fear, not fear of heights, not fear of failure, fear of proving everyone right, a test of nerves. One morning, the site was buzzing with tension. A massive steel frame was being lifted into place, the heaviest load Michael had ever handled. Eric was there. So was Marcos. And so was Russo. Michael climbed into the crane, his hands steady but his mind racing. Don't mess this up. Don't mess this up. The radio crackled. All right, Michael. Take it slow. Bring it up steady. He gripped the controls, his breath steady. Slowly, carefully, he began to lift. The steel frame rose off the ground. Higher, higher. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Workers on the ground guided him, their signals precise. He followed each one carefully, keeping the load stable. Everything was going smoothly until a gust of wind. The frame tilted. Michael's hands tightened on the controls, his pulse spiking. If he overcorrected, the entire load could swing dangerously. If he didn't react fast enough, it could tip too far and crash. Seconds. He had seconds. The workers below started shouting. Michael gritted his teeth and did the only thing he could. He trusted himself. With a careful, precise movement, he adjusted the balance, bringing the frame back under control. Silence. Then, cheers from the ground. Michael let out a long breath, his fingers trembling slightly. The steel frame was secure. He had done it. Russo's gamble. That evening, as the workers packed up for the day, Russo approached him. Michael tensed, expecting another jab. Instead, Russo smirked. Not bad, rookie. Michael raised an eyebrow. That almost sounded like a compliment. Russo chuckled. Don't get cocky. He pulled something from his pocket, a small roll of cash. Betting pool, he explained. Some guys didn't think you'd last a month. Looks like I just won. Michael stared at the money. They had been betting on him to fail. Russo shrugged. Take it. You earned it. Michael shook his head. Keep it. Maybe next time, bet on the guy who needs it more. For the first time, Russo actually looked impressed. He pocketed the money, giving a small nod before walking off. Michael exhaled. He hadn't just won a bet today. He had won something far more valuable. Respect. The real fight begins. As Michael left the site, his phone buzzed. A text from his lawyer. Emily's mother has filed for full custody. Court date set. Be ready. Michael's stomach dropped. He stood there, staring at the words, his entire body frozen. Everything he had fought for, everything he had built, was on the line. And now, it was time for the biggest fight of his life. Michael sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at his phone. The message from his lawyer felt like a ticking time bomb in his hands. Emily's mother had filed for full custody. He had expected it. He had felt it coming ever since she showed up at the construction site. But knowing it was official made his stomach churn with something worse than fear, doubt. Could he really win this? He had no money for a high-end lawyer, no house with a backyard and a picket fence, no stability, at least not the kind that courts like to see. He had a job. He had determination. But was that enough? Michael ran a hand over his face. He couldn't afford to think like this. He had no choice but to win, preparing for the fight. The next morning, he met with his lawyer, a sharp but overworked man named Daniel Carter. Carter sighed as he flipped through Michael's file. I won't lie to you, Michael. This will be tough. Michael nodded. Tell me what I need to do. Carter leaned back. Your ex has a stable home and, on paper, a more predictable life. The court leans toward that. Your biggest strength is that you've been the primary caregiver. If you can prove you're providing a safe environment, that'll help. Michael's stomach tightened. And what are my chances? Carter hesitated. That pause said everything. Michael clenched his fists. So you're telling me I could lose my daughter just because I'm not rich? Carter sighed. I'm telling you that judges like stability. If you want to win, you need to show them you can provide that. Michael exhaled. He had been building something for himself. He had fought tooth and nail for every inch of progress. But it still wasn't enough. A helping hand. That evening, after another grueling shift, Michael was packing up his things when he heard a voice behind him. Hey! He turned. Eric Trump. Michael had learned something about Eric in the past few weeks. He wasn't the type to waste words. If he was here, it was for a reason. Eric crossed his arms. I heard about the custody case. Michael stiffened. Word traveled fast. Eric studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You need an apartment. Michael blinked. What? The court's going to look at where you're living. And from what I hear, that's not working in your favor. Michael's jaw tightened. I can't afford a new place right now. Eric nodded as if he expected that answer. Then he pulled something from his pocket. A key. Michael's breath caught in his throat. What is this? Eric held it out. A one-bedroom apartment near the site. Not a handout. Call in advance on your pay. Michael stared at the key. No one had ever offered him anything like this. He wanted to say no, to prove he could do it on his own. But this wasn't about his pride. This was about Emily. Michael swallowed hard, then took the key. I'll pay you back. Eric smirked. Damn right, you will. A place to call home. That night, Michael took Emily to see their new apartment. It was small, but it was theirs. For the first time in years, Emily had her own bed, her own space. Michael watched as she ran her hands over furniture, her wide eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time, security. She turned to him, beaming. Daddy, is this really ours? Michael felt a lump form in his throat. Yeah, sweetheart, it's really ours. And at that moment, he realized this wasn't just about winning a court case. This was about giving his daughter the life she deserved. And no matter what it took, he wasn't going to lose. Michael had faced hardship before. He had gone to bed hungry. He had worked until his hands bled. He had felt the weight of failure press so hard against his chest that he thought he would never breathe again. But none of that compared to this moment. He stood outside the courthouse, his palms sweaty, his mind racing. Inside, a judge would decide the future of his daughter. Would she stay with him, or would she be taken away? He inhaled deeply, adjusting his shirt, one of the only nice ones he owned. This wasn't about him anymore. It never had been. This was about Emily. and he would fight for her until his last breath. The battle begins. The courtroom was cold, sterile. Michael sat next to his lawyer, Carter, tried to keep his hands from shaking. Across the room, Emily's mother sat with her own attorney, her expression unreadable, but Michael could see the confidence in her posture. She thought she had already won. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, glanced through the case files before looking at them both. Let's begin. Emily's mother's lawyer was the first to speak. She painted Michael as unstable, financially insecure, unable to provide the life that Emily deserved. While we recognize that Mr. Carter has been employed recently, the lawyer said, his living situation has been unpredictable, and there is no guarantee that his current job will last. My client, on the other hand, has a steady home, a structured life, and the ability to ensure Emily has everything she needs. Michael gritted his teeth. He wanted to scream, to tell them that money wasn't everything, that a real home wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was love, security, sacrifice. But he knew this wasn't about emotions. It was about proof. And now it was his turn, fighting for Emily. Carter stood, straightening his tie. Your Honor, let's talk about what really matters. Who has been there for Emily? Who has raised her, cared for her, fought for her? Michael swallowed hard as Carter continued. My client has been Emily's sole guardian for over a year. He has provided for her, even when he had nothing. He has held down a stable job and recently secured a new home, one where Emily has her own space, her own bed, her own stability. Carter turned to Emily's mother. Where was her mother during that time? Silence. Michael's heart pounded. Carter looked back at the judge. We're not asking for the impossible. We're asking for fairness. A father who has fought every day to give his daughter a better life should not be punished simply because he isn't wealthy. Stability isn't just about income. It's about commitment, about being there when it matters. Michael clenched his fists under the table. This was it. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. I've heard enough. I'll make my decision shortly. Michael exhaled shakily, his entire body tense. This was the longest wait of his life. The verdict. The judge finally looked up, his expression unreadable. After reviewing the case, I have made my decision regarding custody of Emily Carter. Michael's breath hitched. The room was dead silent. Emily will remain in her father's custody. Michael froze. For a second, he wasn't sure if he had heard it right. Then it hit him. He had won. Emily was staying with him. A wave of relief crashed over him, so powerful that he thought he might collapse. He turned to Carter, who gave him a small nod. Across the room, Emily's mother's expression darkened, but Michael didn't care. His daughter was safe. She was his. And for the first time in years, he felt free. Michael stepped out of the courthouse, the cold autumn air hitting his face. As he exhaled a breath he felt like he had been holding for years. He had won. He looked down at his phone, a dozen missed calls from Eric Trump, his boss, his mentor, the man who had given him a chance when no one else would. For a moment, Michael just stood there, letting the realization sink in. Emily was his. He had fought, he had suffered, and he had won. But this wasn't just about victory. It was about what came next, the celebration that mattered. Michael didn't throw a party. There was no champagne, no celebration at a fancy restaurant. His real celebration was coming home, unlocking the door to his own apartment, and seeing Emily waiting for him. She ran up to him, wrapping her tiny arms around his waist. Daddy. Michael lifted her into his arms, holding her tight. For so long, he had feared that this moment wouldn't come, that he would wake up and find that it had all been ripped away from him. But not this time. He had earned this. Emily pulled back slightly, tilting her head. Did we win? Michael swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing a smile. Yeah, sweetheart, we won. She grinned. That means we don't have to move again? Michael shook his head. No, we're staying right here. This is home. Emily hugged him again, tighter this time. I love you, Daddy. Michael closed his eyes. This was everything. A future worth fighting for. A few days later, Michael walked into the construction site with a different posture. He wasn't just a guy who had barely scraped by anymore. He wasn't Charity Case. He wasn't the man people whispered about behind his back. He was Michael Carter, and he had proved every single person wrong. Eric Trump spotted him from across the site and walked over, his usual smirk in place. "You're late." Michael glanced at the time. "I'm 3 minutes early." Eric chuckled. "You're late in the way that matters. I expected to hear from you days ago." Michael rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, sorry. Things have been a lot." Eric nodded. "I heard. Congratulations." Michael hesitated, then met his gaze. "You helped me more than you had to." "Thank you." Eric raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do anything." Michael scoffed. "You gave me a job when I had nothing. You earned that job." Michael exhaled. Maybe that was true, but he still wouldn't forget the people who believed in him when he barely believed in himself. Eric crossed his arms. "So what's next?" Michael frowned. "Next?" Eric nodded. "You think you can just be a crane operator forever?" Michael stared at him. "I hadn't really thought about it." Eric smirked. "Think about it. You didn't come this far to stay in the same place." Michael didn't answer right away, because deep down, he knew Eric was right. This was just the beginning, the final lesson. That night, Michael sat with Emily in their small but safe apartment. She was drawing something with crayons at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration. He had done this for her, and he would keep going. No more running. No more just surviving. For the first time in his life, Michael wasn't just reacting to the world. He was building something. And this time, he wasn't afraid anymore.